The wind that scoured Hailstone Bluff that evening carried the story of the land. It was a dry, restless wind, born in the high plains and funneled down through the valley, gathering scents as it came. It smelled of sun-baked sage, of the sharp, mineral tang of dust, and the faint, almost imperceptible promise of distant thunder. A low hum that vibrated in the teeth more than it was heard. It carried the scent of horse sweat, a rich animal perfume rising from the flanks of the tired beasts tied to the hitching posts outside the coyote lantern. And beneath it all, there was the deep, earthy smell of cattle and churned soil, a scent that clung to the isolated ranch of Calder Reese, a solitary outpost tucked against the valley's rocky rim as if seeking shelter from the vast, indifferent sky. The coyote lantern was less a building and more an act of defiance against the wilderness. Thrown together from rough-hewn pine logs, its timbers were already silvered by the Wyoming sun and wind, its roof patched with sheets of rusted tin that sang a mournful tune whenever the breeze picked up. Inside, the air was thick enough to chew. It was a miasma of cheap whiskey, stale tobacco smoke, unwashed bodies, and the greasy residue of fried meat. Kerosene lamps, their glass chimneys smudged with soot, cast a jaundiced, flickering light that made shadows leap and dance in the corners. It was a place for men who had too much grit in their souls and not enough coin in their pockets. Tonight, it was also a marketplace. At the front of the room, on a makeshift stage, stood a man named Silas Croft, an auctioneer whose face was a roadmap of busted veins. He wasn't selling livestock or land claims. He was selling labor contracts. Men and a few women, down on their luck and bound by papers they likely couldn't read, were paraded before the jeering, half-drunk crowd. Their debts were being sold to the highest bidder, their bodies and time bartered for a handful of dollars to work on a ranch or in a back-alley laundry for a fixed term. Silas's gavel, a crude mallet of oak, fell with a sharp crack on the chipped surface of a liquor-stained table, each impact sealing a small, desperate fate. "Next up, we got MV, Silas bellowed, his voice raw from whiskey and shouting. He squinted at a smudged manifest. "Says here she's a cook, 6-month paper. Who'll start the bidding for a woman who knows her way around a skillet?" A figure was nudged forward from the shadows. It was a woman, though her form was lost in a dusty, travel-worn dress that might have been brown or gray. The dim light and grime made it impossible to tell. The stitching on her low-cut bodice was frayed, a silent testament to hard miles. What caught the eye was the triangular bandana, a piece of faded calico, tied neatly to cover her nose, mouth, and jaw. It hid half her face, leaving only her eyes and the high sweep of her cheekbones visible. They were dark eyes, wide and still, taking in the room without blinking, betraying nothing. Her hands were clasped loosely in front of her, the knuckles pale. She did not look like a cook. She looked like a survivor, and the men in the room, connoisseurs of desperation, could smell it on her. They knew the scent of someone who needed a roof over their head more than they needed pride. A few crude jokes were tossed from the crowd. "What's under the mask?" Silas. A pretty smile or a toothless grin. "The contract's for cookin', not for lookin'," Silas shot back, drawing a wave of raucous laughter. "Her work's guaranteed. The rest is your own business. Do I hear $1? A man in a greasy buckskin jacket raised a finger. $1. $1 it is, a bargain for 6 months of hot meals. Another man, his gut spilling over his belt, sloshed his beer and yelled, $1.50 a working woman ought to be worth the price of a good bottle. He winked, a slimy, knowing gesture. The contract covers her labor, not her will. The room rumbled with coarse amusement. The woman, M. Davy, did not flinch. Her gaze remained fixed on a point somewhere beyond the back wall, as if she were staring straight through the pine logs and into the coming night. Her stillness was a strange sort of armor. The bidding stalled. She was an unknown quantity. The covered face a gamble most weren't willing to take. The men here preferred their transactions simple, their goods laid bare. Then, a voice cut through the noise. It wasn't loud, but it had the weight of granite. $2 and a saddle. Every head turned. Calder Reese stood near the doorway, having slipped in unnoticed. He was a tall man, broad in the shoulders, with a quietness about him that seemed to absorb the saloon's clamor. His face was weathered by sun and wind, etched with lines that spoke of solitude and long days under an open sky. His eyes, the color of a stormy sea, were fixed on the auctioneer, not the woman. He hadn't so much as glanced in her direction. He simply stood there, a solid, unmoving presence. Silas Croft blinked. Momentarily thrown, a saddle was an unusual offer, but a worn-out saddle was worth more than 50 cents. A saddle? You say what kind? Used, serviceable. Calder said, his tone flat. There was no room for negotiation in his voice. The man in the buckskin jacket grunted but didn't counter. The other bidder shrugged and took a long swallow of his beer. There was something about Calder Reese that discouraged competition. He moved with a deliberation that suggested he never made a move he wasn't prepared to finish. $2 and a saddle it is, Silas declared, bringing the gavel down with a final, echoing crack. Sold to Calder Reese. The papers are here. MV is yours for 6 months. Calder moved to the table. He laid $2 silver on the scarred wood, their clink sharp and clear in the sudden quiet. He didn't look at the woman as he signed the contract with a steady hand. Silas pushed the paper toward him, a greasy smile on his face. You got yourself a bargain, Reese. She's strong. You can see that. He gestured toward Mariah. Calder picked up his coins and turned to leave. He finally looked at the woman, though his gaze was impersonal, assessing. I'm paying for peace, he said, his voice a low rumble that barely carried past the table. Yet everyone seemed to hear it. Not a pretty face. The statement, stark and devoid of any pretense, hung in the smoky air. It wasn't an insult, nor was it a kindness. It was a fact, stated as plainly as the price he had just paid. The saloon was utterly silent. In the back, a man who knew him muttered to his neighbor, just loud enough to be overheard. He spends more time with cattle than with people. Calder ignored them all. He gave a slight nod toward the door, a silent command for the woman to follow. She moved without a sound, her dusty dress sweeping the floorboards as she trailed him out of the suffocating heat of the coyote lantern and into the cool embrace of the twilight. The trail back to the ranch was little more than a pair of ruts carved into the earth. The sky had deepened to a bruised purple, and the storm that had been a distant threat was now a gathering certainty. The wind grew colder, carrying the first stinging pellets of hail. They were small, no bigger than grains of corn, but they struck the skin with a sharp bite. Mariah walked beside his horse, her head bowed against the wind. She hadn't spoken a single word since leaving the saloon. She simply walked, her pace steady, her back straight. Calder watched her from the corner of his eye. He saw her flinch slightly as a piece of hail struck her cheek. Without a word, he unbuttoned his heavy canvas jacket, shrugged it off, and held it out to her. She stopped, looking first at the jacket, then up at him. In the fading light, her eyes were dark pools of uncertainty. She hesitated for a moment, then took it. The jacket was heavy, smelling of leather, dust, and the clean, faint scent of the man himself. It swallowed her small frame, the sleeves hanging well past her hands, but it was a shield against the biting hail. She pulled the collar up, and they continued on in silence. Night fell quickly, a thick, starless dark that consumed the landscape. The world shrank to the small, bobbing circle of light cast by the lantern hanging from Calder's saddle horn. The light swayed with the horse's gait, throwing their elongated shadows onto the path ahead, making them seem like two lonely ghosts adrift in an ocean of blackness. The only sounds were the rhythmic plodding of the horse's hooves, the creak of saddle leather, and the soft, insistent patter of hail on the canvas of his jacket. When they finally reached the ranch, the homestead was a collection of dark, hulking shapes against the horizon. The main house, a sturdy log cabin, was dark. The barn, a massive structure, stood sentinel over the corrals. As they entered the yard, the wind howled through the eaves of the barn, and the big door groaned on its leather hinges. Inside, the cattle stirred and lowed, their deep, resonant calls filled with an ancient unease at the smell of the coming storm. Calder dismounted and tended to his horse, his movements efficient and practiced. The woman, Mariah, though he did not know her name, stood by the barn door, a small, still figure wrapped in his oversized coat, the lantern light casting a warm glow on her face, the bandana still securely in place. When he was done, he picked up the lantern and led her inside the barn. The air was warm and rich with the scent of hay, manure, and livestock. It was a comforting, living smell. He led her to the far end, to the hayloft. With a pitchfork, he quickly arranged a thick, clean pile of hay in a sheltered corner, spreading an old woolen blanket over it. It was a rough bed, but it was dry and warm. He set the lantern down on a nearby crate, its light pushing back the deep shadows of the loft. He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "You can stay here," he said, his voice even. He gestured with his chin toward the main house, a dark shape visible through the open barn door. "There's a spare room in the house, small, empty, but it has a cot and a door that locks." He paused, letting his words settle in the quiet space between them. "The choice is yours," he said, and his gaze was direct, holding hers. "Here, no one puts you where you don't want to be." It was the most he had said to her, and the offer of a choice, a thing she likely hadn't had in a long time, was as startling as a shout in the stillness. She looked from the haybed to the dark house and back again. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, she gave a single, almost imperceptible nod and moved toward the makeshift bed in the corner of the loft. She turned her back to him, facing the rough-sawn planks of the wall, presenting him with only the straight, unyielding line of her spine. She wasn't trembling, but a tension radiated from her, the taut, vibrant stillness of a drawn bowstring, ready to snap at the slightest touch. Calder watched her for a moment longer, then took his leave, shutting the big barn door against the rising wind. He left the lantern on the crate, its soft light a solitary beacon in her new, uncertain world. Outside, the first real clap of thunder rolled across Hailstone Bluff, a deep, heavy sound that shook the very foundations of the barn. It was answered by another sound, softer, more subtle, the frantic, silent beating of two lonely hearts, strangers sheltering under the same roof, listening to the storm break. The new day did not arrive with a glorious dawn. It crept into Hailstone Bluff, a thin, gray watercolor wash that diluted the black of the sky. The storm had passed, leaving the air washed clean and sharp, smelling of wet earth and bruised sage, long before the first light touched the valley floor. A spark flared in the darkness of the main cabin. Calder Reese was awake. He moved with a practiced economy of motion, wasting no energy. The scrape of the kindling box, the metallic click of the stove door, the whisper of the flames catching these were the first sounds of the day. Soon, the aroma of strong, boiled coffee began to fill the small cabin, a rich, smoky scent that cut through the morning chill. He stirred a pot of beans, remnants from a day before, adding a small can of tomatoes and a dash of molasses, letting them simmer over the low heat. He mixed a simple batter of cornmeal, water, and salt, and poured it into a heavy, greased skillet. The hiss of it hitting the hot iron was a sharp, comforting sound. He was a man accustomed to a solitary rhythm. His meals were functional, eaten standing by the stove or at the small, rough-hewn table. His thoughts already on the day's work, a fence line down in the south pasture, a heifer that looked to be calving soon. But this morning, His routine fractured. He paused, the coffee pot in his hand. After a moment, he reached into the cupboard, his large hand dwarfing the simple tinware, and pulled out a second bowl and a second mug. He set the table. 2 bowls, 2 mugs, 2 spoons. The symmetry looked alien, a disruption of a long-established pattern. He filled both bowls with the steaming beans, placed a thick wedge of golden cornbread beside each, and poured coffee into both mugs. He sat in his usual chair and waited, the steam rising in twin columns in the cool morning air. Mariah entered the cabin as silently as a shadow. She had shed his heavy coat, though she still wore the same dusty dress. Her bandana was firmly in place, obscuring her face, but her eyes, visible above the cloth, were wary. They scanned the room quickly, cataloging the space, the exits, the man sitting at the table. Then, her gaze fell upon the table setting. It locked onto the second bowl. She stood frozen in the doorway for a long, stretched-out minute. Calder did not speak. He did not gesture for her to sit. He simply drank his coffee, his gaze directed toward the window, giving her the space to make her own choice. The offering was there, but it was not a command. Slowly, as if testing the solidity of the floorboards with each step, she moved to the table. She did not sit opposite him, but at the adjacent side, keeping him in her periphery. Her hands hovered over the bowl for a second. Then, with a decisive, quick movement, she picked up the spoon. She pulled the bandana down just enough to uncover her mouth, keeping the rest of her face shielded. Mariah ate with a deliberate, measured pace. Each spoonful was raised, held, and then taken. It was not the desperate, hurried hunger of a starving vagrant, but the cautious, assessing act of someone measuring the cost of every bite. She was tasting the food, but more than that, she was tasting the moment, probing it for traps. Calder ate his own breakfast. The only sounds in the cabin, the scrape of spoons against tin and the soft sigh of the fire in the stove. When she finished, she placed the spoon neatly beside the empty bowl. Her eyes lifted, not quite meeting his, but settling on the shelf just behind his head. It held a few meager possessions, a worn Bible, a tin of rifle oil, a stack of old almanacs, and 2 other items, sitting apart. One was a sturdy wooden comb, its teeth dark and smooth with age. The other was a length of silk, folded into a neat square. It was a deep, soft olive green, the color of pine needles in shadow. It was old, but it was not ragged. Calloused, practical, quiet Calder. He noticed the direction of her gaze. He set his mug down with a soft thud. "My mother's," he said, his voice low. He didn't point. He didn't need to. "She brought them from back east, said they were useless out here." He paused, a flicker of a memory passing behind his eyes. "But she'd use the comb and wear the scarf when she said she needed to remember who she was, beyond the dust and the work." Mariah's gaze lingered on the green silk. It was a color of softness, of a life she couldn't remember. Her hand, raw-knuckled and chafed, lifted from her lap. She reached out, her fingers extending slowly, and just barely grazed the surface of the folded silk, a breath of a touch. Then, she pulled her hand back as if burned. She did not take it. Instead, her hand moved to her own face, with a slow, deliberate motion. She untied the bandana from behind her head. The faded calico fell away, dropping into her lap. The morning light, streaming in through the window, struck the left side of her face. It was not a grotesque injury, not a fresh wound. It was an old story, written on her skin. A pale, silvery line rippled from the high point of her cheekbone down toward the corner of her jaw. It was the kind of scar left not by a clean blade, but by something torn, a mark of violence that had healed badly, pulling the skin taut. It gleamed faintly, a permanent disruption in the smooth, olive tone of her skin. She did not turn away. She sat, her face bare, and met his eyes for the first time. Calder looked at the scar. He saw it, acknowledged it, and then his gaze moved back to her eyes. He did not ask. He did not react with pity or shock. He simply accepted it, as he accepted the weather or the harshness of the land. He turned back to his breakfast, finishing the last of his cornbread. He rose and took his bowl to the wash basin. "Had a calf last spring," he said, his back to her, his voice conversational. "Born during that late blizzard. Mother didn't make it. Found the little thing half frozen, stiff as a board. Brought it in here." He gestured to the spot by the stove where she had stood. Fed it with a rag soaked in whiskey and warm milk. For 3 days, it just laid there. Didn't think it would see a fourth. He scrubbed the bowl with a rough brush. 4th morning, I came in, and it was standing, shaking, but standing. Called him Scrap. He rinsed the bowl and set it on the drying rack. "He's the loudest, ugliest steer in my herd now." He turned, drying his hands on a piece of sacking. "Point is, things that get broken can still mend. They just mend tough." Mariah watched him, her expression unreadable. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of the stove. When she finally spoke, her voice was rusty, low, as if unused to forming sentences. "I can mend harness," she said. Calder nodded, listening. "I can braid rope, rawhide or hemp." Another nod. "I am not good at sleeping." This last part hung in the air. It was a confession, more intimate than the scar. It spoke of nights spent listening, of a body that could not, or would not, surrender to unconsciousness. "The ledgers," Calder said, gesturing to a worn book on the shelf. "I'm poor with figures." "I can keep a ledger," she replied. "The mending basket is by the fire. The work is there. I will do it. There's a mare in the corral. Gentle. Name's Thimble. She'll need riding if you're to go for supplies." She just looked at him. "I can teach you," he said. And so an agreement was struck, forged not in words of contract, but in the spaces between, an unspoken treaty of non-intrusion. He offered work, not questions. She offered labor, not her history. Their days settled into a new rhythm, a quiet orbit around the ranch's demanding needs. Mariah took over the cabin. She cooked, she mended, she scrubbed the pine floors. In the evenings, she sat by the fire, the ranch ledger open on her lap, her pen scratching neatly across the pages, tallying bales of hay and sacks of flour. Calder took to the pastures. He mended the fences. His hammer blows a distant, rhythmic percussion against the silence of the valley. He rode the lines, his body a familiar shape against the horizon, and in the late afternoons, he taught her to ride. Thimble, the mare, was old and patient, with sleepy eyes and a steady gait. Calder was a patient teacher. He didn't crowd her. He showed her how to check the cinch, how to hold the reins lightly, how to move with the horse, not against it. "You don't force her," he said, his hand resting on the mare's neck. "You ask. She's a partner, not a tool." Mariah listened. She learned. She was stiff at first, her body held in that same coiled tension, but the horse's warmth and steady breathing seemed to seep into her. After a week, Calder watched her ride a wide circle around the corral, her back straight, her seat firm. She was a natural, a piece of the wild that understood another. The nights were harder. The thin partition between the main cabin and the adjoining storage room where he had moved the cot for her after the first night in the loft felt as flimsy as paper. But the storm that had welcomed her returned, rolling in from the plains as if summoned. Rain lashed the roof, and the thunder, no longer distant, cracked directly overhead, a violent tearing of the sky. Cal next to the storage room was the loft, where she now slept on a cot he'd moved from the house. It was drier, warmer, and had a solid door through the thin plank wall. Calder herded a sharp, Involuntary intake of breath as a bolt of lightning struck the ridge, its thunder simultaneous and deafening. He heard the cot creak, the sound of her sitting bolt upright, her fortress of calm breached by the storm's assault. He waited. The wind howled, rattling the cabin's single window. Another crack of thunder, closer this time. He heard a small, muffled sound, as if she'd pressed her face into the blanket. He rose from his own bed. He didn't go to her. He didn't knock. He knew that would only frighten her more. Instead, he went to the tack room, his footsteps heavy and deliberate on the floorboards, letting her track his movement. He fumbled in a box and returned, stopping just outside her door. He hung something on the wooden latch. Then he went back to his room. A few minutes later, amidst the roar of the rain, a new sound joined the night, a gentle, metallic tink-tink-tink. It was the sound of a small, brass cowbell, the kind he used for the lead steer. He had hung it on her door, where the wind whistling through the cracks made it chime softly. Erratically, it was a sound of the herd, of safety, of normal life. It was a small, steady anchor in the chaos of the storm. He lay in the dark, listening. The rain hammered down, the thunder rolled, and beneath it all, the small, persistent tink of the bell. After a long while, he heard the creak of the cot again, the sound of her lying back down. The following evening, the rain had subsided to a miserable drizzle. Mariah was finishing the ledgers by the firelight while Calder sat at the table, a torn canvas shirt in his hands. He was trying to mend a long rip in the sleeve, but his hands, calloused and huge, were clumsy with the small needle. He held a piece of white thread, far too thin for the heavy fabric, and squinted, trying to thread the needle for the third time. He cursed under his breath, a low, frustrated sound. As he pricked his finger, he was sucking on his thumb, glowering at the needle, when he heard it. It was a small sound, a puff of air from her nose, almost a snort. He looked up. Mariah was watching him, her hand covering her mouth, but her eyes were crinkling at the corners. The scar on her cheek moved. It was a smile, a tiny, rusty, but undeniable smile. The sight of it stopped him cold. It was the first sign of light he had seen in her. He held up the needle and thread, a look of profound defeat on his face. My mother, she handled this part. Mariah's smile faded, but the warmth remained in her eyes. She put down her pen, walked over, and gently took the shirt and needle from his hands. She went to the mending basket, selected a thick waxed thread and a heavy-gauge glover's needle, with quick, efficient stitches. She began to draw the torn canvas together, her work neat and strong. They sat in silence, the only sound the pop of the fire and the rhythmic shush of the needle pulling thread. "If someone comes looking for you," Calder asked, his voice quiet, directed at the fire. It wasn't an interrogation, just a thought spoken aloud. Her hands stilled for a beat. Then she resumed sewing. "I'm done running," she said, her voice just as quiet, but hard as river stone. "I'm just not ready to tell." He nodded. That was enough. Later, they went to their separate rooms. The storm had blown itself out, leaving only a cold wind that moaned under the eaves. Mariah lay on her cot, listening to the silence of the house. Calder was on the other side of the thin wooden wall. She could hear the faint sound of him turning a page in his almanac. The wind shifted, pushing a draft through the gap under her door. It carried a scent with it. It wasn't the barn smell of hay or the kitchen smell of old coffee. It was the clean, sharp, bracing scent of pine soap, the soap he used, the scent of his mended shirt, of his skin, of the man himself. It was a smell that meant no harm, a smell of quiet strength, of fences mended and beans in a pot. Mariah closed her eyes. The bandana folded on the crate beside her. The scar on her cheek felt cool in the night air. She breathed in the scent of pine, and for the first time in more nights than she could count, She was not listening for the sound of a boot on a gravel path, or the click of a latch. She was just listening, and beneath the wind, she could hear the steady, quiet breathing of the man in the next room. It was, she thought, the sound of peace. The high sun of midday beat down on Hailstone Bluff, bleaching the color from the sky and baking the dust in the yard to a fine, pale powder. Heat shimmered above the corrals, distorting the familiar shapes of fence posts and water troughs. The only refuge was the deep shade of the porch that wrapped around Calder's cabin, a cool, dark slash against the sun-blasted landscape. Here, the air was still and thick, smelling of the dry pine of the cabin walls and the faint, sweet scent of the wild roses climbing a nearby trellis. They sat on the porch steps, a shared, unspoken ritual of the noon hour when the heat was too oppressive for heavy work. A pile of worn leather tack lay between them. Calder was working a stiff new strap for a broken bridle, his large hands surprisingly deft as he worked saddle soap into the leather, his movements slow and methodical. Mariah was restitching a seam on a saddlebag, her needle dipping in and out of the thick hide with a quiet, rhythmic efficiency. The only sounds were the soft whisper of her thread, the gentle creak of the leather in Calder's hands, and the lazy buzz of a fly circling in the shade. For weeks, their silence had been a comfortable thing, a space built of mutual respect for unspoken boundaries. But today, the silence felt different. It was not empty. It was full, charged with the weight of a story waiting to be told. Mariah set the saddlebag aside. Her hands, which were never still, rested in her lap. Calder felt the shift in her stillness more than he saw it. He stopped working the leather, his hands going quiet. He did not look at her, but kept his gaze on the shimmering horizon, giving her the courtesy of not being watched. "Dry Creek Hollow," she said, her voice soft, yet carrying clearly in the heavy air. "That's the town I came from." Calder gave a slight nod, a silent signal that he was listening. "It's not a real town. It's a railroad camp that got stuck. Just a line of muddy shacks and tents that follow the track being laid. A place for men to spend their wages before they've even earned them." She paused, her eyes seeing a place far from the peaceful porch. "I found work at the boarding house, cooking, cleaning. The owner, a man named Eli. He was a hard man, but fair enough at first." She picked at a loose thread on her dress. "The railroad pays the men in scrip, not real money. They can only spend it at the company store or the boarding house. The prices are high. The men are always in debt. Eli, he told me my room and board were covered by my work, but that a woman alone, she had to pay extra for the privilege of safety, for him not to sell her contract to someone worse." Calder's hands, resting on his knees, slowly curled into fists. The knuckles went white. He said nothing. "I refused," Mariah continued, her voice flat, recounting the facts without emotion. "He didn't like that. He cornered me in the kitchen one night. He was drunk. He said he owned my contract. Owned me. He grabbed me." Her breath hitched. "Just once. There was a struggle. It wasn't a fight. It was just frantic. I pushed him away, hard. He was clumsy. He stumbled backward. The big cast-iron stove was behind him. The firebox door open. He fell against it. His head hit the iron corner." She looked down at her hands. "He didn't get up. He just lay there. It was an accident. A terrible, bloody accident. But no one would have believed me." The fly buzzed past, a loud, intrusive sound in the sudden, profound quiet. "There's a man there," she went on, her voice barely a whisper now. "Jasper Bellwether. He's the railroad paymaster, the manager for the whole Bitter Juniper line. He's important, respected." Her voice turned brittle. "He's also a thief. I kept the books for Eli at the boarding house. I saw the railroad ledgers. Bellwether was skimming from the workers' pay, shorting their hours, overcharging them for supplies. He was stealing them blind, and they were too tired or too scared to question it. I saw the proof. I told Eli I had seen it." She finally looked at Calder, her eyes dark with the memory. "Bellwether found me standing over Eli's body. He didn't ask what happened. He just smiled. It was his chance. He said I'd tried to seduce Eli, that when he refused me, I killed him in a rage. He painted me as a whore and a murderer in one stroke. It would silence me forever, and he'd be the hero who brought me to justice. He went to get the law, a man on his payroll. I knew I had minutes. An arrest warrant hadn't even been signed yet, but it would be. I ran. I took nothing, only—" Her hand went to the collar of her dress, from inside her bodice. She carefully drew out a thin, flat object. It was a strip of silk ribbon, perhaps an inch wide. It had once been a vibrant blue, but was now faded to the color of a twilight sky. Embroidered along its length in what was once white thread, now yellowed with age, was a delicate, repeating pattern of small waves. It was exquisitely made, the work of a patient and loving hand. "It was my mother's," she whispered, holding it in her palm as if it were a living thing. "It's all I have of her. I've kept it hidden all this time." Calder finally turned his head and looked at her. He saw the woman, the scar, the haunted eyes. He saw the ribbon lying in her palm like a fragile piece of hope. He listened to the end of her story, the unsaid words hanging between them, the fear, the hunger, the cold nights, the desperate auction at the Coyote Lantern. He did not offer platitudes. He did not say he believed her, for that would have been an insult, implying her truth was something to be judged. Instead, he offered a piece of his own brokenness. "One winter, years back," he began, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "I was tracking a mountain lion that was preying on the herd, got caught in a whiteout blizzard up in the Ghost Peaks. Lost my bearings. My horse went lame. I fell into a ravine, broke my leg." He stared out at the valley, but like her, he was seeing a different place, a place of endless, blinding white. "I lay there for a day, maybe two. Time, it stops meaning much. I knew I was dying. I'd made my peace with it. And then, a hand. I thought I was dreaming. A hand reached down through the snow. It belonged to a Ute hunter. I never saw his face clearly. He didn't speak a word of English, and I didn't speak his tongue. He splinted my leg with branches from my own saddle tree. He gave me the last of his water. He half dragged, half carried me for miles to the edge of the lowlands where he knew I'd be found. Then he just vanished, gone back into the snow." He fell silent for a moment, the memory as real as the wooden step beneath him. "I never saw him again, never learned his name, but I owe my life to him. Since that day, I've figured I'm living on borrowed time, that my life is a debt I owe, not to him, but to the idea of him, to the idea that you help a thing that's fallen." He reached into the pocket of his vest and pulled out a small, soft deerskin pouch, its drawstring worn smooth. He loosened the tie and tipped the contents into his calloused palm. It was a single, unremarkable piece of milky quartz, no bigger than his thumb, with a sharp, clean break on one side. "When the rescue party found me, I was delirious. When I finally woke up, the sun was shining through a window. I'd never been so glad to see the light. When I could walk again, I went back out on the plains. This was the first thing I found that caught the sunlight. I've carried it ever since, to remind me." He held his hand out, the stone resting in the center of his palm, a symbol of his own return from the dark. Mariah looked from the stone in his hand to the ribbon in hers. One was hard, angular, and cold, born of the earth. The other was soft, fluid, and warm, the work of human hands. Both were tokens of survival. With a slow, deliberate movement, she leaned forward. She took her mother's ribbon and gently placed it into the deerskin pouch alongside his quartz stone. She did not speak. She did not have to. It was a commingling of their pasts, an unspoken pact. His debt, her burden, now held in a single, shared space. He slowly pulled the drawstring tight, the two treasures sealed together in the dark. That night, a chill wind swept down from the peaks. One of the heifers had given birth to a weak calf, and it shivered in the cold. Calder brought it into the barn, away from its mother, and laid it on a bed of fresh hay near an empty stall. He and Mariah built a small, contained fire in a metal bucket, its warmth pushing back the encroaching cold. The firelight danced and flickered, casting their shadows long and distorted against the barn walls. It caught in Mariah's eyes, turning the dark irises into pools of liquid gold, each flicker a tiny, defiant spark. She was feeding the calf warm milk from a bottle, her touch gentle, her voice a low, soothing murmur. Calder watched her, the firelight softening the hard lines of her face, illuminating the silvery track of her scar not as a flaw, but as a part of her landscape. In that moment, she was not MV, the fugitive. She was a woman, tending to a new life. She was beautiful. As he was banking the fire, Calder caught a movement at the edge of his vision. He glanced toward the main gate of the ranch. A rider sat on his horse, just outside the fence line, a dark silhouette against the moon-dusted plains. He wasn't passing by. He was watching. He sat there for a long, unnerving minute, perfectly still. Calder felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. He didn't move, didn't call out. He just watched, committing the shape of the man and his horse to memory. The horse was a rangy bay. The man wore a long, dark oilcloth duster, the color of plum or dried blood in the faint light. Then, as silently as he had appeared, the rider turned his horse and melted back into the night. The next day, a new tension hummed in the air, but it was a tension of purpose, not fear. Calder showed Mariah how to use a lariat, not for roping cattle, but as a tool. He set up a fence post as a target. "It's not about strength," he explained, coiling the rope. "It's about timing. You feel the weight, you guide it, you don't force it." Her first few throws were clumsy, the loop collapsing before it reached the target. But she did not get frustrated. She listened, she watched, she adjusted. She learned the feel of the rope, the balance, the flick of the wrist. By the end of the afternoon, she was landing the loop over the post 1 time out of 3. With each successful throw, the tightness in her shoulders eased, the reflexive cringe she had whenever she missed, the instinctive flinch of someone used to failure and punishment, lessened. She was standing taller. That evening, Mariah sat at the cabin table, the ranch ledger open before her. The lantern cast a warm circle of light on the page. She dipped the pen in the ink pot, the scratching sound loud in the quiet room. At the top of the page, where she usually wrote the date and the initials M.V., she paused. Her fingers tightened on the pen. Then, in a clear, steady hand, she wrote her full name, Mariah Vale. It was not the scrawl of a fugitive. It was the careful script of a woman reclaiming her own story, 1 letter at a time. The auction was over. The running was done. Whatever was coming, she would face it with her own name. The Red Spur Saloon was a different breed of establishment than the Coyote Lantern. It was built of stone, not logs, and catered to men who did business with coin, not barter. The whiskey was better. The cigar smoke smelled of leaf, not floor sweepings, and the quiet was thicker. It was a place for men who waited. A man sat at a back table, nursing a single, untouched glass of rye. He was lean, with a face that looked carved from sun-dried wood. His clothes were clean, functional. A long-range rifle leaned against the wall next to him. His name was Thorne Kincaid, and he hunted things, not animals. He was a man who found people who had forgotten to pay a debt, or who had been named on a piece of paper backed by gold. He was, in the polite language of the territory, a retrieval agent. He had been asking questions, his voice low and patient, dropping silver dollars on tables not for information, but for the silence after the information was given. His query was specific, repeated with the monotony of a telegraph key. "I'm looking for a woman, new to the area. She favors a bandana. but I'm told she doesn't need it. Told she carries a scar. Left cheek. Last seen drifting toward the high valleys. Maybe on a lonely ranch. The bartender, wiping a glass, paused. There's a few lonely ranches. Reese's place, up on Hailstone Bluff. He's a solitary man, keeps to himself. Kincaid's eyes, the color of gunmetal, flickered up. They were devoid of emotion. Reese, does he have the look of a man who'd take in a stray? He's the kind of man who'd shoot a stray, if it bothered his cattle. The bartender replied, shrugging, or ignore it if it didn't. Kincaid laid another $1 on the bar. My thanks. He finished his rye in one smooth motion, the liquid burning a path down his throat. He felt the familiar weight of the deposit in his vest, a thick fold of bills given to him by a well-dressed man in Cheyenne. A man who never gave his own name, but whose initials, J.B., were embossed on the kid leather wallet he carried. Jasper Bellwether. The instructions were clear. Find the woman, M.V., and bring her back. But the bonus, the part that made the payment so heavy, was for a secondary objective. If you find any ledgers, any account books at all, Bellwether had said, his voice smooth as oiled machinery. Burn them. Burn the place they are in. Make it look like an accident. The woman is secondary to the paper. A rumor with a name attached to it travels fast. But the news of a question travels faster. It moved from the saloon to the stable, from the stable to the general store, and from the general store. It was carried by a nervous deputy to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Lyle Pritchard heard the news and his stomach soured. He was a decent man, which in Wyoming territory meant he was only moderately compromised. He looked at the new rack of repeaters in the corner, a generous donation from the Bitter Juniper Railroad. He thought of the 3 fine patrol horses in the town stable, fed with grain paid for by Jasper Bellwether's Civic Improvement Fund. Law and money. They weren't just standing in the same shade. They were sharing the same canteen. Pritchard was a man caught in the middle. He owed his position to men like Bellwether, but he'd also sworn an oath. He sat at his desk, staring at a wanted poster for a bank robber, and thought instead about a woman with a scar he had never seen, on a ranch he rarely visited. He did nothing. The wind was high when Calder Reese rode the trail back from the south pasture. He saw the rider before the rider saw him. The man was sitting his rangy bay at the crossroads, the same plum-colored duster, the same silhouette he'd seen at the gate. This time, it was broad daylight. Calder didn't reach for his weapon. He just pulled his horse to a gentle stop, his hands resting loose on the pommel. Thorne Kincaid nodded. It wasn't a greeting. It was an acknowledgement. Reese, he stated. That's the name on the gate, Calder said, his voice flat. Kincaid's gaze was analytical. It swept over Calder, the horse, the coiled rope, the rifle in its scabbard. Heard you bought a contract at the Lantern a few weeks back. A cook. I bought a pair of hands. The contract said cook. Sometimes contracts lie. This one had a name. M.V. The paper's in my desk, Calder said, his eyes on the horizon. They say she covers her face. The wind's bad out here. A lot of people cover their faces. Kincaid's hand, resting on his thigh, was inches from the revolver holstered there. It was a well-oiled, efficient-looking weapon. I'm looking for a woman named Mariah Vale. She's wanted for murder in Dry Creek Hollow. Calder's expression didn't change. Never heard the name. Kincaid smiled. It was a brief, humorless stretching of the lips. She has a scar, left cheek. Calder finally turned and met the man's gaze. His eyes were cold as a mountain spring. I told you, I bought a contract for labor. I pay for peace. You're disturbing it. Kincaid stared at him for a long, silent moment. He was weighing the man. He saw the solid set of his shoulders, the absolute lack of fear in his eyes. This was not a man to be pushed or bluffed. This was a man who would be an obstacle, and Kincaid was paid to remove obstacles, but not here, not now. A man protecting his property, I can respect that, Kincaid said, his voice mild. He glanced at Calder's rifle. Old caplock. Heavy. It works, Calder said. Kincaid nodded again. A sharp, bird-like motion. Enjoy your day, Reese. He pulled his horse's head around and trotted off, not looking back. Calder didn't move until Kincaid was a small dot on the plain. He had registered every detail. The tied-down holster, the rifle with a long-range scope, the second, smaller pistol tucked into his waistband, and the eyes, the empty, patient eyes of a man who would absolutely come back. That night, the cabin was a fortress of tense silence. The ledger was put away. The mending basket was untouched by the dim light of a single lantern. Calder laid the heavy caplock rifle on the table. He'll be back, Calder said. It wasn't a guess. And he won't be alone. Mariah's face was pale, but her hands were steady. I know. You know how to use one of these? He asked, tapping the rifle stock. I've fired a scattergun to scare coyotes. This is different. He began the lesson, his voice low and precise, his movements economical. He showed her the percussion cap, small as a fingernail, the powder flask, the ramrod. You pour the powder, not too much. You patch the ball, you ram it home, firm, all the way down. You set the cap, you pull the hammer, you aim, you squeeze. His hands covered hers, guiding her through the motions. They were rough, calloused, but his touch was surprisingly gentle, a purely instructional contact. He was teaching her a skill, not a threat. You have one shot, only one. You have to make it matter. You don't aim to wound. You don't aim to warn. He stepped back, letting her hold the heavy rifle, finding its balance. The goal, he said, and his eyes met hers in the lamplight, is to live, not to win. Winning is for men like Kincaid. Living is for us. They moved to the barn, the lantern casting huge, dancing shadows on a clear patch of dirt floor. Calder used a piece of charcoal to sketch a map of the ranch yard, the main house, the corral, the barn. He'll come at night, Calder said, drawing a line. He'll expect us in the house. He'll try to burn the barn, to flush us out or destroy whatever he's looking for. The ledgers, Mariah whispered. Bellwether's ledgers. Calder nodded. So, we won't be in the house. He tapped the hayloft. This is the high ground. You can see the whole yard. There's a back way out, through the old stall, into the ravine. He marked it with an X. If they split up, one goes to the house, one to the barn. Mariah looked at the crude map, her mind racing. She thought of the bandana, the one she had worn at the auction, the one she had folded and put away, the symbol of her hiding. A decoy, she said. Calder looked up. In the cabin, he's looking for a woman with a scar, but he heard about a woman who covers her face. She picked up her old, faded calico bandana. We light a lamp in the main room. We put this on a chair, draped, as if someone just took it off. Calder studied her, a slow, approving nod. He'll think you're in there. He'll focus on the house first. It buys us time. She was no longer just a victim. She was a partner in this. It was her plan. Before they turned in, Calder sat at the desk for a long time. He wrote a letter on a clean sheet of paper. He wrote down everything Mariah had told him. Dry Creek Hollow, Eli, the struggle, the fall. He wrote about the stolen wages, the faked ledgers, the script system. And at the bottom, he wrote the name Jasper Bellwether, pressing the pen so hard the ink bled thick and black, almost tearing the paper. He folded the letter, melted a stick of red wax, and sealed it with the imprint of an old, plain button from his father's coat. He addressed it to Reverend Gallows, the one man in the territory he trusted to see a thing through. He slipped the letter into his inside pocket. If he didn't return, someone would find it. 2 days passed. The air grew thick, static, as if waiting for a lightning strike. On the third morning, a rider approached. Not Kincaid. This was a smaller figure, on a fast, sweating horse. It was Lottie Mae Carter, one of the few male couriers who braved the high trails. She was a young black woman, with eyes that had seen too much and a weary, determined set to her jaw. She slid off her horse, accepting the dipper of water Calder offered. She didn't deliver mail. She delivered a message, her voice a low, urgent whisper, meant only for Mariah. "I come from Palaver's Gate," Lottie Mae said, her eyes darting to the horizon. "I got friends, folks who work the line, folks who cook and clean. They talk." "Talk about what?" Mariah asked. "About Dry Creek Hollow. About you." Lottie Mae's gaze softened. "There's a witness. Mariah. Someone who was in the boarding house that night. An old cook named Odette Ramos. She saw the whole thing. She saw Eli grab you. She heard the fight. She's scared. Scared of Bellwether. But she says she'll testify. She says she's tired of being scared." Hope, a dangerous, fragile thing, unfurled in Mariah's chest. A witness. She's in Palaver's Gate, but she won't talk to just anyone. Bellwether's men are watching the sheriff's office. She said she'll only talk if she knows it's safe. If you can get there. Lottie Mae put her hand on Mariah's arm. Her grip was strong. "You're not alone in this." Lottie Mae mounted her horse, refused the offer of food, and was gone in a cloud of dust. A fleeting, brave messenger. That night, the full moon rose, bathing the ranch in a cold, silvery light. It made the shadows in the yard sharp and black, like spilled ink. There was no hiding. Calder and Mariah sat in the darkened barn, the unlit rifle resting across her knees. The waiting was the worst part. Then, from the high ridge to the north, a sound drifted down on the wind. A long, mournful cry that raised the hair on their arms. It was a wolf, calling from the rocky pass known as Grief's Ladder. A single, lonely, predatory sound. A shiver ran through Mariah, but it was not from fear. It was a jolt of pure, cold adrenaline. She had been the hunted. She had been the prey. Now, the hunter was coming, and she was waiting for him. She reached over in the dark and put her hand on the warm, steady flank of the mare, Thimble. She tightened her grip on the smooth leather of the reins, her knuckles pale in the moonlight streaming through the cracks in the barn. She looked out at the silver-washed yard, her head high, her scar a pale, defiant line. Let him come. The afternoon heat pressed into the barn, thick and heavy. It was not the oppressive, open-sky heat of the yard, but a close, dusty warmth that smelled of 1,000 dry summers, of cured grasses, and the faint, sharp tang of old leather. Light forced its way through the cracks in the plank walls, cutting the gloom in long, golden shafts. In these beams of light, universes of dust motes danced and swirled, disturbed by their work. They were in the loft, moving the heavy bales of winter feed, stacking them not for storage, but for defense. They were building a nest, a fortified position that overlooked the entire yard. The work was heavy. The dry Timothy hay was prickly, the fibers working their way through Mariah's clothing, sharp against her skin. Dust settled in her dark hair, clinging to the damp strands at her temples, powdering her eyelashes. Calder moved with an easy, powerful rhythm, sinking a hay hook into a bale and swinging it into place as if it were a pillow. He stopped, watching her struggle to lift one, her back bowed, her breath hissing through her teeth. He stepped toward her, but stopped himself. His hands, large and rough, stayed at his sides. "You're lifting with your back," he said, his voice quiet, instructional. "You'll be spent in an hour and sore for a week. Use your legs. Get low." He moved to a bale beside hers. He didn't touch her. He didn't put his hands on her waist to correct her form. He respected the invisible line she had drawn around herself, a barrier he would not cross without invitation. "Here!" He crouched, his own powerful thighs tensing. "The strength is here, in the ground." He pointed to his feet, planted wide. "Push up, don't pull," he demonstrated, the bale coming up smoothly, ending on his knee before he tossed it onto the stack. Mariah watched. She nodded, her face set in concentration. She mirrored his stance, crouching low. The bale was still heavy, but this time, it moved. It came up. She worked beside him, their movements slowly finding a shared rhythm. The air grew hotter. Sweat ran from her hairline, tracing a line down her temple, past the silver track of her scar. She paused, pushing the damp hair back from her face, and her hand went to the high collar of her dress. With a small, frustrated sigh at the heat, she undid the top 2 buttons. It was a simple, practical gesture, meant only to let her skin breathe. The action exposed the pale, smooth skin of her throat, which glistened in the dusty light. Calder had just set a bale down and was turning back. He saw her, hand at her collar, head tilted back as she breathed in the stifling air. His movement stopped. Their eyes met. It was not the quick, averted glance of strangers. It was a long, slow collision. He looked at her, and in that moment, she was not the fugitive Muvvy, nor the survivor, nor his hired hand. She was Mariah. He saw the dust in her hair, the flush of heat on her skin, the weariness in her eyes, and the strength that held her upright. She saw him looking, and she did not flinch. She did not raise her hand to cover her throat. She did not look away. She simply held his gaze. Her breath caught. It lasted 5 seconds, 10. An entire conversation passed between them in the dusty silence, an acknowledgement of the man and woman they were, isolated in this shaft of golden light. Calder was the first to break it, but even his movement was slow. He deliberately turned his head, looking back at the stack of hay. Mariah looked down at her hands. The moment passed, leaving a quiet, humming energy in its wake. That night, the tension of the waiting returned. Kincaid was out there. The moon was waning. The time was coming. They sat at the cabin table. The map of the ranch yard spread between them. "If he comes in shooting, words are useless," Calder said. "We need signals." He tapped his knuckle on the pine table. A single, hard rap. Thump. "1 tap, it means hide. Get down. Don't move. Don't breathe." He tapped again. Thump, thump. 2 taps. Show yourself. Or, I'm moving. It means the way is clear. Or I need you to draw attention. Mariah nodded, her eyes fixed on his hand. He paused, then tapped 3 times. Fast. Thump, thump, thump. 3 taps. Run. Forget the plan. Forget the fight. Get to Thimble. Ride to the ravine. Go to Palaver's Gate. Don't look back. 1 for hide, she repeated, her voice low. 2 for show. 3 for run. She tapped the table. Thump. He nodded. She tapped again. Thump, thump. He met her gaze. Thump, thump, thump. "I'm not running," she said. "It's not running," he countered, his voice firm. "It's living. Like I told you, you get to the witness. You live." They moved to the barn to practice in the space itself. Calder stood by the main door. Mariah climbed the ladder to the hayloft, to the nest they had built. "I'll tap on the main support beam," he called up, his voice echoing in the cavernous, dark space. "Can you hear it?" He struck the beam. Thump! A moment of silence. Then her reply tapped faintly on the loft floor above him. Thump. He smiled in the dark. Thump, thump. Her reply, thump, thump. She started back down the ladder. Her foot, seeking the next rung, slipped on a patch of loose hay. Her balance was gone in an instant. A small, sharp cry escaped her as she fell backward. Calder moved without thinking. He was there in 2 strides. Not to catch her, but to be there. She fell against him, her back hitting the solid wall of his chest. Her head snapped back, her hair brushing his chin. Time stopped. He was rigid, his hands up, not grabbing her, just pressed flat against her sides to steady her. He could feel the fragile strength of her, the quick, terrified rise and fall of her breath. He could feel the warmth of her through her thin dress, under his ear, almost inside his own chest. He felt a frantic, rapid beat. He realized, with a jolt, that it was not hers. It was his own heart, hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Mariah was still for a second, absorbing the shock of the fall, the shock of the contact. She was pressed against a man's body. It was hard and warm, and it was not hurting her. It was simply there, solid, safe. She pushed herself upright, her hands finding the ladder rung to stabilize herself. Calder's hands dropped away the instant she was steady. "You all right?" His voice was rougher than usual. She turned on the ladder, her face level with his. She was so close he could see the faint pattern of her irises in the moonlight from the door. She was breathing fast, but she wasn't afraid. A small, breathless smile touched her lips. It was short, and gone almost before it arrived. She didn't apologize. She didn't thank him. She simply acknowledged the moment, the fall, the catch. She had stumbled, and the world had not ended. She finished her descent. The space between them felt smaller, the air thicker. Back in the loft, as she prepared her cot, Calder appeared at the top of the ladder. He was carrying something. It was the olive green silk scarf, her mother's scarf. She watched, her heart doing a slow, heavy turn, as he walked to a post near her bed. He had hammered a small, clean nail into the wood. He unfolded the scarf, the old silk whispering as it moved, and hung it carefully on the nail. The deep olive color was a patch of civilized softness against the rough, splintered wood of the barn. He turned to her. "The bandana, that's for MV. That's for the woman who hides." His gaze was gentle. "When you want to be Mariah," he said, his voice low and soft. "When you are ready to be who you are, wear this." He didn't wait for a reply. He just turned and climbed back down the ladder, leaving her alone with the ghost of her mother and the promise of her future. The unspoken intimacy, the shared danger, wove itself into the fabric of their days. They shared a supper of pumpkin bread, baked in the Dutch oven. Calder watched her eat. She ate with a quiet focus, and for the first time, she ate the entire slice. She did not wrap the last bit in a cloth. She did not save it for a journey. She was no longer a person saving scraps for the run. She was a person at a table, eating a meal. She was staying. That evening, a cold, miserable drizzle began. It was not a storm, just a persistent, chilling mist that turned the yard to mud. A few heifers had been slow to come in. "We have to get them," Calder said, pulling on his heavy oilcloth slicker. He looked at her. She had only her thin coat. Without a word, he unbuttoned the slicker and held it open. "Get in." She hesitated. "I can—" "Don't be foolish. You'll be soaked to the bone in 5 minutes." She stepped close, her back to his front, and he wrapped the heavy coat around them both, buttoning it in the front. It was awkward, but it was practical. They were a single, four-legged creature under a shell of waterproof canvas. They moved out into the yard. The rain pattered on the coat's shoulders. Inside, it was a small, dark, moving tent. It smelled of oilcloth, wet earth, and the clean, pine soap scent of the man himself. Her shoulder was tucked under his arm. His chin was just above her head. Their hips bumped as they walked, their legs moving in a clumsy, shared rhythm to herd the stubborn cattle toward the barn. She could feel the heat radiating from his chest, a stark contrast to the cold rain on her face. Their breath plumed in the air in a single, shared cloud. It was the most intimate they had ever been, a simple, practical act of survival that felt like something much more. They were shoulder to shoulder, a unified front against the cold and the dark. Later, long after Calder was asleep, Mariah lit a small candle in the loft. The rifle was leaned against the post, near her bed. She took out her ledger, not to write figures, but to write words. She turned to a blank page. She dipped the pen. The date was a guess. The place was certain. August 12th, 1873, Hailstone Bluff. She paused, then wrote a single sentence, the ink biting into the paper, a testament. Today I chose to stand. She closed the book. The waiting was almost over. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was no longer in charge. She blew out the candle and lay in the dark, listening to the rain on the roof. After a long time, she got up. She moved through the darkness to the post. Her fingers found the silk, impossibly smooth in the rough-hewn barn. She took the olive scarf from the nail. She walked to the door of her loft room, the one that led to the barn's interior. She felt for the wooden latch hook on the outside of the door. With a steady hand, she looped the silk scarf over the hook, leaving it to hang where he would see it in the morning. A splash of soft, defiant color in the darkness. It was not a signal for him. Not entirely. It was a signal for herself. A flag raised. She was done hiding. It was time to be seen. A sudden, violent gust of wind, a rogue breath from the plains, slammed the great barn door shut. The heavy iron latch dropped into its housing with a deafening, final thud. It plunged the interior into a deep, cathedral-like gloom. The world outside suddenly muffled and distant. The light rain that had been a mere mist now pattered against the tin roof, a soft, insistent drumming that was the only sound in the world. Inside, the air was warm, a living atmosphere thick with the sweet, cloying scent of cured hay, the dusty perfume of old wood, and the earthy warmth of the animals in their stalls. The single lantern they'd left on a crate cast a pool of trembling golden light, a solitary island in a sea of shadow. It was a space sealed off from the world, a pocket of time where only the two of them existed. Calder was coiling a rope, his hands moving with the slow, deliberate grace of long practice. He felt the door slam, felt the world shrink, but he did not look up immediately. He finished his coil, his mind processing the sudden enclosure. When he did look up, she was already moving. Mariah crossed the space between them. She walked not with the hesitant steps of the woman who had first arrived, but with a straight-backed, deliberate purpose. The rustle of her dress against the scattered hay on the floor was the only sound that broke the rhythm of the rain. She stopped directly in front of him, so close he could feel the faint warmth radiating from her. He could see the pulse beating, a small, frantic bird at the base of her throat. She did not touch him. Instead, her own hand, the fingers trembling ever so slightly, rose to the top button of her dress. Her eyes, dark and deep in the lantern light, met his. They did not waver. They were not filled with fear or challenge. They were filled with a profound, terrifying, and beautiful vulnerability. They held a question and a choice. Her choice. Her voice, when she spoke, was a whisper, but it was not frail. It was raw, cracked, like parched earth after the first drop of rain. It was the bravest sound he had ever heard. "Undo my buttons," she whispered. "I don't care who's watching." The words were an invitation, not to her body, but to her soul. An invitation to see past the scars, past the fear, past the layers of protection she had wrapped around herself for so long. Calder froze. The rope in his hands went slack. The air left his lungs in a silent rush. He saw the woman before him, offering the one thing she had left to give her trust. He saw the years of solitude stretching behind him, a long, lonely road that had, impossibly, led to this moment. The drumming of the rain on the roof seemed to fade, replaced by the roar of blood in his own ears. He had to be sure. He had to give her one last chance to turn back from this precipice. "Are you sure?" "Mariah," he asked, his voice a low, rough thing, his throat tight. He used her name, the one she had reclaimed, a name that tasted of respect on his tongue. She did not speak. She simply nodded, a slow, deliberate and absolute gesture. Yes. He raised his hands. They felt huge, clumsy, like tools made for splitting logs, not for this delicate, sacred task. His calloused fingers brushed against the worn fabric of her dress. He fumbled for the first button. A small, polished piece of bone. It was a simple thing, yet it felt as monumental as a locked gate. His fingers worked the button through the frayed thread of the buttonhole. The touch was slow, deliberate, filled with a reverence that bordered on prayer. The first button came free. He moved to the second, with each one that he released. He felt a layer of her tension fall away. It was not a disrobing for the sake of exposure, but an unburdening. It was a shedding of armor, a peeling back of the layers of fear and flight that had been her only shield. He was not taking something from her. He was helping her let it go. He felt her breathe, a deep, shuddering intake of air as the tight bodice of her dress loosened. It was the first free breath he had ever seen her take. His fingers brushed the warm skin of her collarbone, a fleeting, accidental touch that sent a jolt through them both. He reached the last button at her waist, his movements awkward, his fingers clumsy with the force of the emotion that was welling up inside him. A small, soft sound escaped her lips, a quiet laugh, breathless and real, a laugh of pure, unadulterated relief. It was the sound of a spring uncoiling. He looked up from his task, his face inches from hers. He saw the smile that played on her lips, the genuine, unguarded smile that had transformed her face in the hayloft. And he smiled back, a slow, rusty smile of his own, a smile that cracked the weathered mask of his solitude. In that shared smile, all the tension, all the fear, all the waiting, dissolved like mist in the morning sun. He finished with the last button, and his hands came to rest on her waist. He drew her gently forward. Their foreheads met, resting against each other. They stood like that for a long moment, breathing the same air, their eyes closed, simply feeling the profound peace of the moment. Then he wrapped his arms around her. It was not an embrace of passion, but of homecoming. He held her tight, his arms a fortress around her, his hands spread protectively across her back. He felt her own arms slide around his neck, her fingers tangling in the hair at his nape. She sagged against him, a lifetime of holding herself upright, of being on guard, finally surrendering. He felt a tremor run through her, a final, convulsive release of all the fear she had held inside. He buried his face in her hair. It smelled of hay and dust, and the clean, faint scent of the woman herself. "You're safe," he whispered into her hair. The words a vow, a promise he would die to keep. "You're safe here." She held him tighter, her face pressed into the crook of his neck. He felt the wetness of her tears against his skin, hot and silent. Slowly, they drew back, just enough to see each other's faces. The lantern light caught the shimmer of tears on her cheeks, on her eyelashes. He raised a hand, his thumb rough against her skin, and gently wiped a tear from the corner of her eye. His gaze dropped to her mouth. Her lips were parted, her breath soft and warm. He lowered his head, his movement infinitely slow, giving her every chance to turn away. She did not. She leaned into him, her eyes fluttering closed. The kiss was as slow and deep as a river. It was not a kiss of frantic wanting, but of profound recognition. It was a conversation without words, a story of two solitudes meeting in the dark. His hand moved from her waist to the small of her back, supporting her, holding her up so she would not have to hold herself. Her hands tightened on his neck, pulling him closer. They moved, a slow, unconscious dance, until her back was pressed against a wooden support beam. The rough wood scraped against her dress. The hay rustled and whispered under their feet. The rain on the roof was their orchestra, a steady, rhythmic beat that matched the pounding of their hearts. The world outside, with its bounty hunters and its stolen ledgers, ceased to exist. There was only the barn, the rain, the golden light, and the breathtaking miracle of this. The lantern flame began to flicker, its oil running low. The golden light softened, waned, and finally surrendered to the shadows. In the near darkness, he took her hand and led her to a soft pile of hay in a sheltered corner, where a thick woolen blanket lay waiting. He spread the blanket, a haven of warmth against the cool night air. They sank down into it, a tangle of limbs and soft whispers. There, in the fragrant darkness, they spoke with their hands, with their eyes, with the language of slow, gentle caresses that asked questions and gave answers. They moved with a shared, intuitive grace, pausing whenever a shadow of the past flickered in her eyes, his touch a constant, patient reassurance. It was a quiet, sacred exploration, a mapping of scars, both seen and unseen, and a celebration of the simple, overwhelming fact that they had survived long enough to find each other. Finally, long after the rain had softened to a gentle hush, she lay with her head on his chest. His shirt was open, and her cheek rested against the warmth of his skin. She listened to the steady, powerful, rhythmic beat of his heart. It was not the frantic hammering of a man in the throes of passion. It was the slow, dependable thrum of a life force, a steady engine pumping life and warmth and safety into the world. It was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. She snuggled closer, breathing in his scent, feeling the rise and fall of his chest. She was home. "I'm staying," she whispered into his skin. The words not a promise, but a simple statement of fact. Her running was over. He stroked her hair, his heart too full for words. Outside, in the cold, misty darkness, a shadow detached itself from the deeper shadows of the corral fence. Thorne Kincaid lowered the spyglass from his eye. He had been watching the ranch for hours, waiting. He had seen the lantern in the barn, and in its final, fading moments, he had seen the two distinct shadows on the wall merge, melt, and become one. He smiled, a cold, thin line in the dark. He now knew Calder Reese's weakness. It had a name, Mariah. He turned and slipped away into the night, his boots making no sound on the wet earth. The morning broke cold and gray, the air heavy with the previous night's drizzle. The world felt muted, holding its breath. Calder rose from the hay, the wool blanket still warm from where Mariah lay sleeping, her face peaceful for the first time. The intimacy of the night, the whispered words and gentle touches, felt like a fragile, impossible dream in the harsh light of dawn. He moved silently, pulling on his boots. He needed to check the perimeter. The silence felt wrong. He stepped out of the barn. The ground was soft, a rich, dark mud that held impressions perfectly. And there, near the corral fence, just 20 yards from the barn door, he saw them. The tracks, a single set of hoofprints, a lean bay horse, and beside them, the deep, clear imprints of a man's boots. The man had dismounted. He had stood there for a long time. The ground churned slightly, as if he'd been shifting his weight. He had been watching. He had been watching the barn, listening to the rain, seeing the lantern light flicker and die. He had seen the shadows merge. A cold, hard fury, unlike anything Calder had ever known, settled in his stomach. This wasn't just a job for Kincaid anymore. He had seen Mariah. He had seen them. He had turned a hunt into a violation. Calder's hand clenched. The memory of her whispered, "I'm staying," warring with the raw, muddy proof of their vulnerability. Kincaid now knew where to strike, not just to capture a fugitive, but to hurt the man protecting her. He returned to the barn. Mariah was awake, sitting up, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. The olive scarf still hung on the post, a beacon of her choice. She looked at his face, and her own went pale. She didn't need to ask. "He was here," she said. It wasn't a question. "He was," Calder said, his voice flat and hard.
He watched. He knows.
The dream of the night was over, shattered by the muddy boot prints. But what remained was the foundation. They were no longer two strangers. They were a single unit, and Kinkind had just declared war on them both. "The plan changes," Calder said, his mind moving with a cold, clear precision. "He's not just hunting you. He thinks you're my weakness. He thinks he can use what he saw against me." Mariah stood, pulling her dress on with quick, steady hands. "Then we use that against him." Calder looked at her, at the scar, at the iron in her spine. "Yes," he said. The operation moved fast. There was no more talk, only action. Mariah braided her hair, her fingers weaving the strands with a tight, practical motion. She went to her small bundle of possessions and retrieved the old, faded calico bandana, the symbol of MV, the mask. She tied it loosely around her neck, ready to be raised. Calder was in the corral, moving with a grim efficiency. He saddled Thimble, the gentle mare. Then he saddled his own horse, a lean, muscular gelding built for speed and endurance, not comfort. "You'll ride toward Juniper Hill," he instructed, cinching the saddle on Thimble. "The trail there is wide, the ground is soft. He'll pick it up easy." "And then," she asked, her voice calm, "you don't go to the hill. You go toward it. Ride for a mile, slow. Let the mare drag her feet. Then, you cut east into the creek bed. Follow it back. You hide in the loft. You don't make a sound until I signal. And you, I'm going to Bitter Notch, the back way, through the Black Rock Pass. Kincaid won't know it. I'm meeting Pritchard." He checked the load in his rifle. "We're not just surviving this, Mariah. We're ending it." She nodded. She pulled the bandana up, covering her face, transforming into the decoy, the fugitive MV. She mounted Thimble and rode out, not looking back, a small, solitary figure against the vast, gray landscape. Calder watched her go. Then he swung onto his gelding and spurred the horse in the opposite direction, toward the jagged, treacherous line of black rocks that clawed at the sky. The Red Spur saloon was quiet when Thorne Kincaid entered. He ignored the bartender and went straight to the telegraph desk in the back. He paid for a short message to Cheyenne, addressed to his employer. Found. Hailstone Bluff. Reese. Woman is his weakness. Will retrieve. Full payment expected. K. He walked out, mounted his bay, and trotted toward the trail leading to Juniper Hill. He'd seen the tracks. They were sloppy, obvious. The woman was running, just as he'd expected. He smiled. This was the easy part. Calder's ride was brutal. The Black Rock Pass was a scar on the land, a chaos of shattered granite and loose scree. His horse scrambled, its hooves striking sparks, the air thin and cold. But it was fast. He cut 15 miles off the journey, emerging above Bitter Notch while Kincaid was still following Mariah's false trail. Sheriff Lyle Pritchard was waiting in the shelter of the pass, as agreed. He was not alone. 2 deputies, men with the hard, non-committal faces of territorial law, sat their horses beside him. Pritchard looked annoyed. "Reese," Pritchard grunted, skipping any greeting. "You pulled my men off patrol for this? This better be more than a hunch. Bellwether's been asking about my diligence." Calder dismounted. His face was grim, streaked with sweat and dust. He didn't waste a single word. He walked to Pritchard's horse and slapped a folded, wax-sealed envelope against the man's chest. "That's for Reverend Gallows," Calder said, his voice a low growl. "You give it to him if I'm dead before sunset." Pritchard's eyes widened. He fumbled the letter, his annoyance turning to sudden, sharp apprehension. "Dead, what is this?" "This," Calder said, pulling a slim, oilcloth-wrapped packet from his saddlebag, "is for you." He thrust it at the sheriff. Pritchard unfolded it. It wasn't the original ledger. It was a copy, page after page, in Mariah's clear, precise hand, detailing the faked invoices, the shorted wages, the script totals, a meticulous, undeniable record of Jasper Bellwether's fraud. "That's a copy?" Calder said. "The original is safe. That's Bellwether's system. He's stealing the railroad blind, and the men who work it—" Pritchard's face went gray. This wasn't a local dispute. This was evidence. This was a bomb that could take down the most powerful man in the county. And him along with it.
Reese, this is a damn accusation.
"It's the truth," Calder said. "And the woman you're letting Bellwether hunt is the one who found it."
"Sheriff."
The call came from the trail below.
"Hoofbeats. Fast."
Lottie Mae Carter pushed her horse up the last incline, her face a mask of determination. And she was not alone. Riding behind her, looking pale and terrified but resolute, was an older woman in a cook's apron.
"Sheriff Pritchard,"
Lottie Mae said, sliding from her horse.
"I brought you a witness. This is Odette Ramos, from Dry Creek Hollow."
Odette was trembling, her hands twisting in her apron. She looked at the sheriff, at his badge, and took a deep breath.
"I saw it, sir,"
she whispered, her voice shaking but clear.
"I was in the kitchen. I saw Mr. Eli. He grabbed her. He wouldn't let her go. She pushed him, and he fell. It was an accident, just like she said."
Odette's eyes flashed with a sudden, old anger.
"And Mr. Bellwether, he lied. He told her he'd hang her for it. He wanted her silent."
Pritchard was trapped. The paper in his hand was the motive. The woman before him was the witness. The law and the money were no longer in the same shade. They were at war, and he was standing on the battle line. Kincaid followed the trail up Juniper Hill. It was too easy. The woman was clumsy, dragging a branch now, making a mess of the path. He smelled the trap before he saw it, a faint scent of freshly cut sapling. He reined his horse in, his eyes scanning the dense scrub oak ahead.
Snap.
The sound was tiny, a twig under his horse's hoof. But it wasn't a twig, it was a tripwire.
Whump!
A heavy, deadfall log, cleverly weighted, swung down from the trees. It wasn't aimed at him. It was aimed at the path behind him, crashing down with a sound like a cannon shot, blocking his retreat. His horse screamed, rearing in terror, fighting the bit. Kincaid, a master horseman, fought to control the panicked animal, his focus entirely on the horse. Fweet. A high, piercing whistle cut the air. From the ridge above him, Sheriff Pritchard and his two deputies emerged, their rifles leveled.
Thorne Kincaid.
Pritchard's voice boomed across the clearing.
You're covered. Drop your weapon.
Kincaid was a professional. Surrender wasn't in his contract. In one fluid motion, he brought the horse under control and drew his pistol. He wasn't aiming at Pritchard. He'd seen the real threat. Calder Reese, emerging from the rocks to his left.
Crack!
A shot echoed, but it wasn't Kincaid's. One of the deputies fired, the bullet kicking up a spray of rock and dirt just inches from Kincaid's boot. A warning. The world seemed to stop. Kincaid was pinned, the deputies above, Calder to his side. Thump! Thump! The sound was from behind him, from the Hailstone Bluff Ranch, from the hayloft. It was a signal. Mariah. 2 taps. Show. The sound, the deputies, the warning shot. It was a split-second distraction. Kincaid's eyes flickered. It was all Calder needed. He didn't draw his rifle. He burst from the cover of the rocks, his arm uncoiling. He wasn't holding a gun. He was holding his lariat, which he'd left soaking in the water trough all morning. The wet rope was heavy as a chain. It struck Kincaid with a sickening thwack. The loop went not for his head, but for his gun arm. The wet, heavy hemp wrapping around his torso, pinning his arm to his side. The sheer, unexpected weight and force of it knocked the breath from his lungs and broke his balance. He toppled from the saddle, his pistol firing uselessly into the mud. Before Kincaid could even register the fall, Calder was on him, a knee driving into his back, his hands yanking the rope tight, cinching the loop with a brutal, practiced knot. The capture was over in 3 seconds. It was fast, efficient, and utterly humiliating. Kincaid, his face pressed into the mud, spat and snarled, the fight still in him. "You're a dead man, Reese," he spat. He looked up at Pritchard, his eyes burning with cold fury. "Pritchard, you fool! You have no jurisdiction here. I'm on contract. I'm on official business for Jasper Bellwether." He roared the name, his final trump card. The name hung in the air. Pritchard visibly hesitated. The railroad, the money, the new rifles. He looked at the ledger pages, then at the bound man on the ground. This was the moment. Law or money? "Now, Kincaid," Pritchard began, his voice wavering. "This is a territorial matter." "No, Sheriff, it's not." Lottie Mae Carter stepped forward, pushing past the deputies. She was holding a simple, rumpled brown envelope. It was stained with road dust and sweat, but it bore a United States postal stamp and a clear, round, black ink postmark. Cheyenne, T. Doe, August 14th, 1873. She held it up for Pritchard to see. "This," Lottie Mae said, her voice ringing with authority, "is a copy of Odette's testimony and a summary of Mr. Bellwether's wage theft. I mailed it to the territorial circuit judge 2 days ago. It's in federal hands now." She tapped the postmark. "The U.S. Marshals have been notified. The railroad inspectors are already on their way." It was checkmate. The blood drained from Pritchard's face. He was no longer a small-town sheriff caught in a local fight. He was now a witness in a federal investigation. His hesitation was gone, replaced by the cold certainty of self-preservation. "Deputy," Pritchard snapped, his voice all business. "Get Mr. Kincaid on his feet. He's under arrest. Attempted assault on a peace officer." As the deputies hauled Kincaid up, the barn door opened. Mariah walked out. She was not the Mevy decoy. Her face was bare, the scar a pale line in the watery sunlight that was finally breaking through the clouds. She walked past Kincaid without a glance, stopping in front of the sheriff, with a deliberate, final gesture. She untied the calico bandana from her neck and let it fall into the mud. Calder moved to her side. He didn't speak. He didn't touch her face or her shoulder. He simply reached out and took her wrist. It wasn't a grip of possession or even comfort. It was a silent, unbreakable statement. "I am here. We are here." The rain stopped. The clouds broke. The sharp, clean scent of wet earth and ozone rose from the ground. The smell of a fever that had finally broken. Lottie Mae Carter nodded, satisfaction on her weary face. She gathered her reins. "I've got mail to deliver, but I reckon this news," she said, nodding at the cuffed and furious Kincaid, "will be all over the territory by nightfall." The investigation had begun. The courtroom in Palaver's Gate was not a grand hall of justice. It was a long, narrow room, smelling of unvarnished pine, old paper, and the faint, metallic scent of the potbelly stove that sat cold in the corner. Sunlight, thick with dust, streamed through 2 tall, wavy-paned windows, illuminating the grim, determined faces of the spectators who crowded the benches. They were railroad men with calloused hands, ranchers with sun-cracked skin, and a few townswomen in their best, plain dresses. They had come not for spectacle, but for a reckoning. At the front of the room, Circuit Judge Harlan, a man with a beard like a spade and eyes that had seen every kind of trouble the territory had to offer, presided from a high, carved bench. Jasper Bellwether sat at a table to the right, flanked by a slick, confident lawyer from Cheyenne named Davies. Bellwether's face was a mask of calm, composed indignation, but a muscle twitched in his jaw, a tiny, frantic betrayal of the pressure building within. At the other table sat Mariah Vale and Calder Reese. Calder was a monolith of stillness, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on the judge. Mariah was straight-backed, her hands folded loosely in her lap. She wore no bandana. The scar on her cheek was a pale, clear line in the dusty light, a map of a past she was no longer running from. The first witness was called Odette Ramos. The old cook, her hands twisting the fabric of her apron, walked to the witness stand as if walking to a gallows. The chair squeaked under her weight as she sat. The prosecuting attorney, a young, earnest man from the territorial office, spoke to her gently. "Mrs. Ramos, please tell the court what you witnessed on the night of Eli Stratton's death." Odette took a deep, shuddering breath.
"I was in the scullery,"
she began, her voice a reedy whisper. Washing up, the boarding house was quiet, too quiet. She looked at Jasper Bellwether, a flicker of old fear in her eyes. "Mr. Bellwether, he'd been squeezing us for weeks, forcing me to water the soup, to serve smaller portions. He said the men wouldn't notice. He kept 2 sets of books, one for the railroad and a real one, hidden. Mariah, she saw it. She told Mr. Stratton." "And on the night in question," the attorney prompted. "That night, Mr. Stratton had been drinking. He cornered Mariah in the main kitchen." Odette's hands twisted faster. He was saying terrible things, that her contract meant he owned her, that she owed him more than just her labor. Her voice dropped lower, thick with a shame that was not her own. He put his hands on her. A low murmur rippled through the courtroom. Judge Harlan banged his gavel once. A sharp, authoritative crack. Silence.
"I heard her tell him to stop,"
Odette continued, her voice gaining a thin thread of strength. "And then there was a struggle.
Not a fight, just the awful sound of it. A chair scraped, a pan fell, and then a thud. A heavy sound I won't forget, like a sack of grain falling."
She paused, swallowing hard.
"I was a coward. I hid. When I finally looked, he was on the floor by the stove, and there was blood. Mariah was just standing there, her dress torn. Her face, she was just staring. Before I could move, Mr. Bellwether came in. He didn't even check on Mr. Stratton. He just looked at Mariah, and he smiled. He told her she was a murderer, and that he was the only one who could save her if she kept her mouth shut about the ledgers. Mr. Davies, Bellwether's lawyer, was on his feet. "Objection, hearsay, the ramblings of a frightened old woman." Overruled. Judge Harlan said, his eyes fixed on Odette. "Continue, Mrs. Ramos." "I was afraid,"
Odette finished, her voice breaking.
"He would have fired me. I had nowhere else to go, so I said nothing, but I will not stay silent any longer. What he did to that girl, it was wrong."
She looked at Mariah, a silent, tearful apology in her eyes. Next came Lottie Mae Carter. She strode to the stand with a confidence that filled the room. She carried a heavy, leather-bound mail ledger. "This is the official log for the Bitter Juniper postal route," she stated, her voice clear and strong. "I wish to draw the court's attention to a pattern of interference." She opened the book, her finger tracing a line. On 3 separate occasions, official correspondence from the Railroad Workers Union, addressed to the territorial office, was intercepted. Mr. Bellwether claimed they were improperly addressed and had them returned to his office. Each time, the envelope was marked with a small, red ink symbol, a cross for a wage dispute, a circle for an injury claim. She held up the envelope she had delivered to the judge. This letter, containing Mrs. Ramos's testimony, was also marked, a red square, a symbol, my sources tell me, that Mr. Bellwether used for matters he considered a direct threat to his personal business. The evidence was mounting. A wall of paper and testimony, brick by brick. Sheriff Pritchard was called. He walked to the stand, his face grim. He recounted the events of Kincaid's capture, his voice a low, factual monotone. He admitted his initial hesitation. "I was slow to act," he said, not looking at anyone. "Mr. Bellwether is an influential man. But the evidence presented by Mr. Reese was clear. My duty was clear. I submit the official report of the arrest of Thorne Kincaid, an agent acting on the verbal contract of Jasper Bellwether. Finally, Mr. Davies stood to cross-examine Mariah. He approached the witness stand, his smile predatory. "Miss Vale," he began, his voice dripping with condescension. "Or should I say, M.V. You seem to have a history of changing your name to suit your circumstances. Do you not? You arrived in Hailstone Bluff under a false identity, a fugitive from a murder charge." Mariah did not answer immediately. She sat, a pillar of calm. "Is it not true," Davies pressed, "that you are a woman of flexible identity, a woman who would say anything, accuse anyone, to save her own skin?" Mariah stood up. The movement was not aggressive. It was deliberate, imbued with a quiet power. The entire room leaned forward. She looked not at the lawyer, but at the judge. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it filled the space, clear and steady as a bell. "My name is Mariah Vale," she said. "I used the initials M.V. because I was afraid Mr. Bellwether made me afraid. I ran because he threatened to see me hang for a death that was an accident, a death that happened while I was defending myself from a man's unwanted advances." She turned her gaze to Davies. "I did not murder Eli Stratton. I did not lie about the ledgers, and I am not lying now." She sat down. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. She had not offered a passionate defense. She had offered the simple, unadorned truth. And in that room, it had the force of a landslide. Judge Harlan stared at Jasper Bellwether for a long, silent minute. Bellwether's mask of composure had shattered. His face was pale, his hands trembling slightly on the table. The judge cleared his throat. "Based on the testimony of Mrs. Ramos and the evidence presented by Miss Carter," he announced, his voice booming in the still room, "this court hereby dismisses the warrant for the arrest of Mariah Vale concerning the death of Eli Stratton. Her contract of indenture is declared null and void." A wave of relief washed over the spectators. "Furthermore," the judge continued, his eyes like chips of flint, "this court finds sufficient cause to open a full criminal investigation into the affairs of Mr. Jasper Bellwether on charges of embezzlement, mail fraud, and bribery of a public official. Mr. Bellwether, you are remanded into the custody of Sheriff Pritchard." Two deputies moved to stand behind a stunned Jasper Bellwether. It was over. When Mariah and Calder stepped out of the courthouse and onto the sun-drenched wooden steps, the crowd that had gathered did a strange thing. They did not cheer. They did not jeer or whistle. They simply parted. A path opened for them through the sea of bodies. Miners took off their hats. Women nodded. It was a silent, powerful acknowledgement. On the frontier, where life was cheap and justice was often for sale, the truth, when it finally won, was given a rare, quiet respect. Calder reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out the olive-green silk scarf. He didn't speak. He just held it out to her. Mariah took it. Her hands were steady. She did not tie it around her neck to hide her throat. She did not use it to cover her scar. She folded it into a neat band and tied it in her hair, pulling the dark strands back from her face. The soft, green silk was a touch of color, of life. It was an adornment, not a shield. She was choosing how the world would see her. The scar was part of her, and she was done hiding it. A man with a notepad hurried up the steps. "Miss Vale Samuel Reed, from the Pipeline News. Do you have a statement? How does it feel to be free?" Mariah looked at the reporter, her gaze clear and direct. "I don't need pity," she said, her voice strong. "I needed the truth." The news traveled, as Lottie May had predicted, with the speed of the telegraph. The railroad, fearing a federal scandal, acted swiftly. A team of inspectors was dispatched from Cheyenne. Jasper Bellwether's career, his power, his carefully constructed empire of theft, was over. He had disappeared from the story, a ghost already fading into the territory's long memory of failed, greedy men. That night, back at the ranch, the air was still and cool. There was no loud celebration. There were no toasts or shouts of victory. The victory was in the quiet, in the simple, shared rhythm of their lives returning to a new kind of normal. They ate supper at the small cabin table, the two bowls no longer a novelty, but a fixture. After the meal, they washed the dishes together. He washed, his large hands gentle with the tin plates. She dried, the cloth moving in slow, circular motions. They did not speak much. They did not need to. The silence was full of a deep, abiding peace. When the last dish was put away, Calder went to the porch. Mariah followed him. A sliver of a moon hung in the vast, starry sky. The wind whispered through the pines. He turned to her and held out a hand. She took it. He drew her close, and they began to dance. There was no music, save for the chirping of the crickets and the sigh of the wind. It was a slow, shuffling two-step on the rough-sawn planks of the porch. His hand rested on the small of her back, a warm, solid presence. Her head rested on his shoulder. They moved as one. Two solitary figures who had found their center in each other. It was a quiet, profound celebration. Not of a victory won, but of a home found. The peace that followed the trial was a fragile, delicate thing, like a skim of ice on a pond. For 2 days, the ranch at Hailstone Bluff existed in a state of grace. The air was clean, the work was honest, and the nights were filled with a quiet, shared peace. But it was the false calm of a sky gathering its breath before a final, violent storm. The third night was as black as the inside of a tomb. There was no moon, no starlight, only a thick, oppressive blanket of cloud that swallowed the land. The silence was absolute, a deadened quiet that muffled the chirp of crickets and the rustle of the wind. It was the kind of night that felt wrong, a night when predators moved. Jasper Bellwether did not come back as a man of the law. He came back as a cornered animal, stripped of his position, his reputation in ruins, and with federal marshals closing in. He was a man with nothing left to lose. He returned with 3 men, hard cases hired from a Cheyenne gutter, their faces shadowed by the brims of their hats, their belts heavy with pistols. Their purpose was not justice. It was annihilation. The goal was simple: burn the barn, destroy the original ledger Calder had hidden there, and silence the woman who had started it all, forever. They left their horses in a grove of cottonwoods a half-mile away and approached the ranch on foot, dark shapes moving through the deeper darkness, their boots making no sound on the damp earth. But the ranch was not asleep. A single point of light bloomed in the blackness, a lantern, burning steadily, hung just inside the main barn door. It was a beacon, a clear and deliberate invitation. Inside, in the center of the golden circle of light, Mariah Vale stood waiting. She was not cowering in a corner. She stood tall amidst the scattered hay, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. She was the focal point of the entire scene, a living target, tied in her hair. The olive-green silk scarf moved softly in the draft from the open door, a small, brave flag of color in the gloom. This was not the frightened M.V., hiding from the world. This was Mariah, choosing her ground. This was her stage, and she had set it herself. Above her, hidden in the suffocating darkness of the rafters, Calder Reese lay flat along a massive support beam. He was as still as the wood he lay on. He did not hold his heavy rifle. He held the old caplock fowling piece, a double-barreled shotgun. He had drawn the lead shot from the cartridges. They were now packed tight with coarse rock salt, a load meant to sting, to blind, to incapacitate with agonizing, non-lethal force. He was a protector, not a killer, and this was his final line of defense. His gaze never left the woman standing in the light below. The 4 dark figures appeared at the barn door. their silhouettes black against the night. Bellwether stepped forward, his face a pale, contorted mask of rage in the lantern light. He held a pitch-soaked torch in one hand and a pistol in the other. "Well, well," he sneered, his voice a low, venomous hiss. "The little bookkeeper, waiting for her fate. Did you really think you could ruin me and just walk away?" Mariah did not answer. She simply stood her ground, her chin high, her eyes fixed on him, refusing to give him the satisfaction of her fear. "I'm going to burn this place to the ground," Bellwether snarled, his voice rising. "With you and your precious ledgers inside it, no evidence, no witnesses." He raised the torch to the lantern, the flame catching with a greedy whoosh, the fire cast dancing, monstrous shadows on the walls. One of the hired guns produced a second torch, lighting it from Bellwether's. They were going to make sure the fire caught fast. Bellwether took a step forward, the flaming torch held high, ready to throw it into the hayloft. At that exact moment, Mariah moved, with a speed that belied her calm posture. She bent, grabbing the handle of a heavy wooden bucket that sat at her feet. With a cry that was more a roar of defiance than a scream of fear, she swung the bucket forward, its contents arcing through the air in a glittering spray. Salt water, a full bucket of it, taken from the pickling barrel. It hit Bellwether's torch with a loud, explosive hiss. The flames vanished, sputtering out in a cloud of acrid, greasy smoke, leaving the torch a blackened, useless stick. For a split second, Bellwether stood in stunned, dripping disbelief. Boom! The roar of the shotgun from the rafters was deafening. It was not aimed at a man. The blast of rock salt, a white, ghostly cloud in the lantern light, struck the second torch. The flaming head disintegrated in a shower of sparks and burning pitch, shattering like glass. The barn was plunged back into the singular, lonely light of the lantern. "Federal agents, drop your weapons." The voice was a roar from the darkness outside. Sheriff Pritchard and 4 deputies, their rifles raised, stormed into the barn from 3 directions, their movements practiced, their purpose absolute. Chaos erupted. One of the hired guns, thinking fast, dove for the shadows. The other 2 raised their hands in instant surrender, their fight gone with the arrival of the law. But Bellwether was different. He was fueled by a pure, nihilistic rage. He was already ruined. His only goal now was to drag Mariah down with him. In the confusion, he lunged, not for his gun, but for her. He was fast. His arm snaked around her throat, yanking her back against him, his body a shield. He pressed the cold steel of his pistol barrel against her temple. "Everybody back!" he screamed, his voice raw with desperation. "Back, or she dies right here!" Pritchard and his men froze, their rifles trained on the struggling pair. Mariah was caught, her breath cut off by the pressure of Bellwether's arm. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through her. But beneath the panic was something else, the memory of training, the memory of a quiet voice in this very barn. The strength is here, in the ground. She didn't struggle against his hold. She drove her heel down, hard, onto the arch of his foot. He grunted in pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all she needed. She dropped her weight, her knee coming up sharply, striking the back of his thigh, buckling his leg. As he stumbled, she spun, not away from him, but into him, twisting under his arm. Her hand shot up, grabbing his wrist, her thumb pressing down on the nerve. His fingers went numb, and the pistol clattered uselessly to the hay-strewn floor. She completed the turn, her other hand coming up, her elbow locking his arm at an unnatural angle. It was a perfect, brutal, and beautiful execution of the move Calder had taught her. She was in control. From above, a dark shape dropped from the rafters. Calder landed in a crouch, silent as a cat. He did not have a weapon in his hand. He didn't need one. As Bellwether, his arm trapped and useless, tried to turn, Calder was on him. He didn't throw a punch. He simply moved in, his body a solid, irresistible force. He seized Bellwether's free arm, twisted it behind his back, and used his momentum to drive him face first into the damp, packed earth of the barn floor. The fight was over. Pritchard and his deputies moved in, tying the hands of Bellwether and his 3 stunned men. As they hauled a sputtering, defeated Bellwether to his feet, 2 more figures stepped into the lantern light. They were dressed in city clothes, their faces grim and official, federal inspectors. One of them knelt beside Bellwether and began searching his pockets. From an inside coat pocket, he pulled a slim, leather-bound book. He opened it. "The second ledger," he said, his voice flat. He continued his search, pulling out a sheaf of folded papers. "And the false pay stubs. All the evidence we need. Take him away. Sheriff." Mariah stood, breathing heavily, her heart hammering in her chest. She looked at the olive-green scarf, which had been torn from her hair in the struggle and now lay trampled in the mud and salt water. She bent and picked it up. It was dirty and wet, but the silk was not torn. It was resilient. She squeezed the salt water from it, a symbolic wringing out of the last of the fear, the last of the poison. She walked to the massive wooden post by the barn door, the one where Calder had once hung the scarf for her. With steady hands, she tied it firmly around the post. It hung there, limp and damp. Not a pretty adornment, but a survivor's flag. Her claim, her victory. As if on cue, the night rain, which had been a threatening presence, finally ceased. The clouds began to part. The sharp, acrid smell of the failed torches and the lingering smoke began to dissipate, replaced by the clean, hopeful scent of the damp earth. As the deputies led a cuffed and shackled Jasper Bellwether out of the barn, he twisted his head for one last look. He saw Calder Reese standing beside Mariah Vale. Calder's hand was resting on her shoulder, a simple, solid gesture of presence. They were not touching otherwise, but they stood together as a single, unbreakable unit. Bellwether saw in their unified stillness a kind of wealth he had never understood, a victory that all his money and power could never buy. A raw, bitter hatred filled his eyes, the hatred of a man who had lost everything to something he could not comprehend. In the commotion of Bellwether being taken away, a small deerskin pouch, the one Calder always carried, was jostled from his vest and fell to the floor. It landed softly, the drawstring coming loose. A milky white piece of quartz rolled out, followed by a delicate, faded blue ribbon embroidered with tiny waves. Mariah bent down. She ignored the quartz. She picked up the ribbon, her mother's ribbon. She turned to Calder, who was watching her, his face unreadable in the lantern light. She took his wrist, the one on the hand that had taught her to fight, that had held her in the dark. She said nothing. She simply, carefully, tied the faded blue ribbon around his wrist. The delicate, embroidered silk was a stark contrast to his calloused, weathered skin. It was not a decoration. It was a bond, an unspoken promise, a debt of life, a burden of the past, now tied together, forever. The seasons turned. The harsh, unforgiving gray of a Wyoming winter retreated, surrendering the land to a tentative, then triumphant, green, a carpet of new grass, tender and bright, spread across Hailstone Bluff, softening the hard edges of the rock and soil. Meadowlarks, their songs like splashes of liquid gold, swooped low over the fields. In the pastures, the new crop of calves, drunk on new life, bucked and spun, their clumsy legs carrying them in wild, joyful arcs like small, furry arrows loosed from a bow. The land was healing, breathing a long, slow sigh of renewal. Beside the great barn, the silent witness to their story, a new structure had risen. It was not a building, but a promise made of wood and air. Calder had built a simple arbor, 4 posts of stripped pine sunk deep into the earth, with a roof of clean, sun-bleached linen stretched taut against the sky. Lottie May, on one of her mail runs, had brought a gift several cuttings of wild mountain lavender, which Mariah had woven into the frame. Their faint, clean perfume now scented the air, a gentle blessing on the breeze. Their guests were few, but they were the right ones. Odette Ramos, her back straight and her eyes clear, had made the long journey from Palaver's Gate. Sheriff Pritchard stood near the back, his hat in his hands, his face a study in quiet, hard-won peace, and with him were a handful of the railroad men, their faces scrubbed clean, their best-worn clothes on their backs, men who had received their back pay and had come to witness the wedding of the woman who had fought for them. There was no priest, no official in a black coat. There was only the wide, open sky and the weight of promises to be made. Inside the cabin, Mariah stood before the small, steel-framed mirror that Calder had spent an hour polishing until it shone like a pool of silver water. She looked at her reflection. She saw the woman who had arrived in dust and fear, and the woman who stood there now. They were the same, and yet they were not. With steady hands, she took the olive-green silk scarf. She did not tie it as a mask. She folded it neatly and tied it in her hair as a headband, the soft fabric a touch of grace against her dark, clean hair, the silvery line of her scar. No longer a mark of shame to be hidden. Caught a ray of sunlight slanting through the window and seemed to shimmer, not as a flaw, but as a seam where she had been broken and mended stronger. On the bed lay a veil. It was a simple, delicate thing she had made herself. She had taken an old, rough burlap sack, the kind used for potatoes, and had washed it again and again in lye soap and creek water until the coarse fibers had softened and bleached to a creamy, translucent white. She had hemmed it with a simple white thread. It was not a veil to hide behind. It was a symbol of something wild that had been tamed, of something rough that had been made beautiful through patience and care. It was the story of her own heart. She draped it over her hair, the soft fabric falling to her shoulders, a whisper of tradition on her own terms. Calder stood under the arbor, waiting. He held a small, flat piece of pine board in his hands, the words he had carved into it facing his chest. He saw her step out of the cabin, and the world, for a moment, seemed to hold its breath. She walked toward him, the simple veil moving in the breeze, the sun catching the olive silk in her hair. She was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. When she reached him, she took his free hand. He turned the piece of wood over, his knuckles white. His voice, when he spoke, was a low, steady rumble. The words read not from the wood, but from his heart. "I choose to stand beside you," he said, his eyes locked on hers, "even when the whole world is watching." Mariah smiled, a slow, radiant smile that seemed to light the day. Her own promise was not written down. It was carried inside her. "I choose," she said, her voice clear and strong, "to undo the old buttons of fear and fasten them again with trust." He set the board down. He cupped her face in his hands, his rough palms gentle against her skin. Their foreheads touched, and then he kissed her. It was a kiss of profound, quiet certainty, deep and slow, a sealing of souls under the wide Wyoming sky. In the middle of the kiss, a loud, comical moo erupted from the nearby corral, a young heifer protesting the lack of attention, the sound, so profoundly normal, so rooted in the reality of their life, broke the solemnity. Odette chuckled. The railroad men laughed. Pritchard cracked a smile. The world rushed back in, not as an intrusion, but as a welcome. Life, ordinary and beautiful, was returning. That night, there was no celebration in a crowded hall. Their wedding feast was a quiet meal in the cabin. Later, they went to the barn, to the loft, the place where their story had truly begun. The floor had been swept clean. They spread the thick woolen blanket on the smooth pine boards. In the soft, silent darkness, he took her hand, and they danced. There was no music, only the sound of their breathing and the whisper of their feet on the floor. It was a slow, swaying dance of two people who had found their rhythm. When the dance was done, she lay with him on the blanket, her head on his chest, her hand spread flat over his heart, feeling its steady, dependable beat, the sound of life, the sound of safety. "Home," she whispered into the darkness, the single word a culmination of her entire journey. The next morning, they rose together. They walked to the great barn door, their hands meeting on the heavy wooden bar. Together, they pushed it open. Sunlight, brilliant and clean, flooded the space, cutting through the dusty air. The tiny motes of hay and dust, caught in the golden shafts of light, swirled and danced like a benediction, like salt being sprinkled on a new life, and tied to the post by the door. The olive-green silk scarf, now clean and dry, fluttered in the morning breeze. It was no longer a symbol of what could be. It was their flag. A week later, Lottie Mae brought the news, a letter, with an official territorial seal. Jasper Bellwether had been convicted on all charges. His assets were seized, and restitution was being paid, in full, to every worker he had cheated. And at the bottom, a single, beautiful sentence. By order of the Circuit Court, the name Mariah Vale is hereby cleared of all wrongdoing and restored to good standing. The story was over. The circle was complete. That evening, as they were finishing the chores, a sudden, playful gust of wind swept through the yard, slamming the barn door halfway shut with a familiar, rattling bang. Mariah, who was carrying a pail of water, stopped. She looked at the door, and then it called her. A slow, mischievous smile spread across her face. The fear that the sound once held was gone, replaced by a deep and abiding love. She looked at him, her eyes sparkling, and whispered the words she had spoken on that first rainy night. But now, they were not a plea. They were a light, intimate tease, a secret shared between two hearts. "Undo my buttons." Then she laughed, a full, free sound that carried on the wind. She set the pail down, and with her own hands, she undid the top button of her heavy canvas work coat, pulling the collar open to let the last warm rays of the evening sun touch the skin of her throat. There was no one else watching. There was no need. They had chosen to see each other, and that was the only gaze that would ever matter again. Thank you so much for joining us for this story. Where in the world are you listening from? Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed our journey to the Old West, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a thumbs up to help this story reach even more listeners. Please also hit the hype button to show your support. We'll see you in the next chapter.